Hi and welcome back. So now we're going to talk about how electric customers are charged for the cost to serve them. So we're going to talk about electric rates. I mean, don't we have a great business here? People want to tell us how we should generate electricity. They want it on demand 24/7 through storms, through good weather, through hot weather, cold weather, whatever. You want your electricity, right? But I'm going to tell you that not only are how you should generate it, but I really don't want to pay for it. And I don't want a rate increase, right? Nobody likes rate increases. Do you like rate increases? I don't like rate increases, but I like electricity. I like steady electric power and so on. And so like any product or service, you have to pay for it. So that's what this short segment is about. We're going to keep it at a high level. Although when you get done with this, you'll be able to say, hey, I'm an expert in electric rates because I know about all the pieces and parts and how they're developed. So to start it off, we should talk about the philosophy of rate making. Now, rate development has been around since the dawn of the electric age, so well over 100 years. I mean, there's a lot of scholars over time that came up with different ways to charge electric rates and pay for electric service, but really the core philosophy of rate making has stayed steady and true since the dawn of the electric age. And that is that rates should be fair and equitable. Rates should generate revenues that recover the cost of service for a defined period. Rates should reflect what caused the cost, and rates should be predictable. Now, your customers, they don't like rates that bounce around. They like steady rates. They would like rates to go down, but they don't like rates that would go up sharply. If they have to bear a rate increase, it should be steady and smooth. And that is the philosophy of rate making. And as we'll see a little later in this presentation, the philosophy of rate making and the math behind the cost to serve customers kind of run at odds from time to time. So we'll talk about some of those issues as well. But basically, developing electric rates has three parts. First, you develop a revenue requirement, how much money you need to run the utility or co-op for a defined period of time. Then you do a cost of service study where you assign the cost of providing service to the people that are and customer classes that are causing the cost. And then we develop electric rates. And out the bottom comes equitable rates and happy customers. You see there, they're jumping for joy. Yeah, no, they're not. They're calling you saying, don't increase my rates. I'm on a fixed income. I didn't cause this cost. Why should I pay for it? You've heard all the excuses. But in any case, the rates have to be designed to recover the cost of service. And that cost of service is based on the revenue requirement. So the revenue requirement consists of three pieces as well. Operating costs, so the cost to run the utility or co-op, so power costs, labor costs, all those types of operating costs, the cost to trim the trees, run the office, read the meters, and cost of those natures. So the ongoing annual operating costs. Then the depreciation expense on the assets you install to serve customers. And what those do is they wear out over time. For example, if you put in a pole, that pole lasts 30 years. And so what that means is that every year, 1/30th of that pole is used up. And we recognize that through depreciation expense. And once the 30-year period has gone by, in theory, we'll have enough funds set aside to replace that pole. Now, in practice, the way it works is you have depreciation expense. Every year you have routine capital additions to replace assets that were placed into service over a variety of years, but the idea is that you use that depreciation expense and recognize it to fund replacement of existing plant infrastructure. And then finally, the return on rate base. And what the return on rate base is a rate of return, the cost of capital of the total investment you have to serve your customers. So say you have a $50 million infrastructure investment to serve customers. That includes power plants, transmission lines, distribution facilities, office facilities, and so on. Well, you should get a return on that, and that rate of return is based on the cost of capital, which kind of runs about where your bond rates are, and a little margin on top of that. So roughly these days, early 2022, about 5 to 7%. And you use that return on rate base to pay back debt that you take out. We talked earlier about financing debt. So you pay back that debt with that, and you replace infrastructure if depreciation doesn't cover the costs that you need. So we call this the utility method of rate making. So you see here the utility method of rate making in action. We have a utility with operating expenses of $50 million, depreciation of $8 million, and the return on rate base of $5 million, which is calculated down below here. We have our net book value of plant and service. Our rate of return is 5%. And so our return on rate base is $5 million. So we total that up, we have $63 million. So we see our revenue requirement for next year, for the budget year, is $63 million. Now the idea is that you want to fully cost your utility construction projects, so that you want to make sure, like I said, with depreciation expense, so that the infrastructure investment that you have to serve your customers, you have the funds available to replace that. And you do that through including depreciation expense and the return on rate base in your customer rates. Now when you look at the typical cost structure in a utility or co-op, you'll see that most of it is power supply. Whether you self-generate or buy your power from another utility, a wholesale power utility, power supply is about 75% of the total cost in a utility rate structure, utility cost structure rather. About 10% of the cost is labor and 15% is other operating costs. Now when you look at labor, labor works like a fixed cost in a utility or co-op. You have a defined number of, it's based on headcount, you have a defined number of people you've hired, and those people, especially in the line crew area, they're either doing capital projects or they're doing maintenance, things like that. The only way to reduce that cost is to reduce headcount. When it comes to power supply, if your customers use less power, the dollar amount you pay for power supply goes down. And if they use more power, the power cost goes up, and that's passed back through to the customers. So that operates as a variable cost. And so in other words, it remains at 75% of the total. And so that means when people say, hey, why don't you just cut costs? Well, 75% are variable, 10% are fixed. We have this other slice of 15% that we could work with on a cost reduction, but it's not a lot to work with. What you're left with there are things like customer service, non-people costs, finance non-people costs, employee benefits, things of that nature, maintenance projects, the materials part of it, and so on. So there isn't a lot of room to work there, and that's why you need to have accurate cost of service studies based on that in order to have equitable customer rates and pass those costs through differences, but it does take time. Other rate considerations is that the cost of service rates and actual rates are not necessarily the same due to strategic goals, and as I mentioned, those historically embedded utility trends. So you might have some strategic goals for energy conservation. Maybe you bump the rates up more for the residential each time to try to tamp down demand and things like that, especially as we move towards more electrification. You might have some of those issues going on. But it is important to know what the cost of service is so that you can determine what the cross subsidies are between the different rate classes. So that's an important factor to know, especially as you plan your long-term rate strategy. But the key to successful cost recovery is having a good budget, a solid revenue requirement, having your long-range planning in place as far as forecasting future operating costs, capital improvements, debts, and also rate increases included in that, and then having a regular rate adjustment. It breaks my heart sometimes when you go to a utility and they say, wow, we haven't raised rates in 10 years. Well, I think you're doing a disservice to your customers by doing that. You need to have annual rate adjustments or biannual rate adjustments at a minimum to keep up, especially with the changes in the industry. So our key takeaways from this section, remember now you're an expert in rates. Don't forget that. The 3 steps are develop the revenue requirement, analyze the cost of service, and develop customer rates. And how costs are classified in the general ledger drives that cost of service study. And electric fixed charges generally undercollect the utility's fixed cost by at least 50% of the actual fixed cost. So when folks come to you and say, hey, my customer charge is going up $2 a month, that's nuts. I can't afford that. This is information to have. Doesn't make it any easier for them to take it, but at least you know from a rate perspective that you're being more than fair when it comes to those fixed costs, and that's something that over time you'll need to address. So now you rate experts, we're down to one last segment, and that is talking about some of the current and the long-term utility trends. And there's a lot of them going on. So we'll cover that, and I'll see you right back here in just a couple of minutes. Thanks. Bye.